host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time, to talk about military doctrine, military history, the leadership of great military figures, and apply them to our business and professional lives. So today, I'm going to talk about I guess there's kind of a pun here, a sensitive topic. So over the last, I think, couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about classified information and classified information stored improperly and all these kind of things. My purpose here is not to be political. It's to understand how classified information works within the military, so that we can set up similar protocols in our businesses, but also just for our own knowledge, so we can better understand events that are happening in our country. Just understand what some of the rules of the game are, how this kind of thing works. So I know this is a little bit of a departure from what I normally talk about, but I think that it's worth taking this little bit of a side road here, given the kind of things that are going on and what's at stake. So I do have my handy dandy PowerPoint, and I call this "Protect Your Business's Secrets," right? Because first of all, not all businesses have top secret type information, or trying to remember the phrase that's used in Animal House by Dean Wormer, double secret probation. Sorry, that has nothing. I was thinking that it was double secret, double top secret. But anyway, slight digression. But in any event, we do have typically in our businesses information that should not be disclosed. If it's a healthcare business, we have to comply with HIPAA minimally, and there may be, we may actually have a higher level of confidentiality, in a healthcare business than HIPAA even requires. If you're in any kind of service business, whether you're a lawyer, an accountant, a real estate broker, an appraiser, all of those carry duties of confidentiality and or privileged communication with your clients, not to mention clergy, who have the highest level of privileged communication with what's called clergy penitent privilege, which is virtually absolute. And so if we're going to store information anywhere but in our heads, these days with cloud storage, with network computers, etc., we do have to be careful about how we handle those things. And so I think you will find this information instructive. So as is always the case on the Way to Wow shows, everything revolves around the 3 pillars of attainment. Typically, we're dealing in the finances realm of the pursuits pillar, but whenever we're dealing with confidentiality, there's probably other people involved, whether it's the other people whose privacy is being protected, or the other people who are trying to get access to the private information. So that plays into it as well. All right. So when we talk about classified data, classified information, there's really 4 issues we need to examine. One is the classification system itself. Okay, what are the classifications? What do they mean, etc. Next is access control. Who gets to see the classified data? Next what are the security measures that are taken in order to protect the classified data? And then finally, what are the results? What is the discipline meted out for someone who violates the classified nature of the data, violates the secrets of our businesses, right? And so I think you'll see very much a one-to-one correlation as we go through this. Okay, so there are basically 3 levels of classified data. I added a 4th one because in the military you do see this. So the highest level of classification is top secret. The next is secret. The next is confidential. And the last one is oh gosh, it's FUOU, which and I'm going up on the acronym all of a sudden. Wow, that's for official use only. Okay, for official use only. And all of these, they describe information that should not be accessible by everyone, okay? Even for official use only. For official use. Oh, I did it backwards. It's actually FOUO. Sorry, I just realized that. That's why I'm going up on this. Even for official use only, this is not information that someone should be, talking about at a party. It's not classified in the sense of the higher levels, but it's just not for everyday discussion. Okay, and so the higher the level of classification, the more potential damage there would result from the disclosure of that data. Okay, so in a business, there's probably a lot of for official use only data, which may not actually damage the building or cause a legal liability for the company if it were released. But nonetheless, it doesn't need to be sort of spread out all over the place. Confidential data, on the other hand, this may be something that falls under HIPAA. It may fall under a professional obligation we have, as I mentioned before, for lawyers, accountants, etc. And so there are potential penalties in the civilian world for its dispersal or its its improper disclosure. So, does your business have secret type or top secret type data? Well, as I understand it, Coca-Cola does not disclose the formula for Coca-Cola. That's a tightly kept business secret. Okay, so in that case, I would say you have that kind of level, and if you have some sort of proprietary formula for anything, whether it be food, some sort of proprietary chemical formula, the disclosure of that can have a materially bad effect on your business, right? Now, we all know that industrial espionage goes on. There's lots of talk about how China looks to get a hold of formularies, for example, for prescription drugs, and then they manufacture those drugs in violation of patent protection, et cetera, right? So the question would be, how do they get access to that information? And it must be that either their data systems are getting hacked, or there are people within the companies who have access to that information who should not, right? Just the same as we see in the military, right? So all these things need to be looked into for your businesses. Okay, now when classified information exists, and especially if it's in hard copy, there are going to be markings on it. And you've probably all seen in TV or movies, like they'll be stamped top secret. Doesn't really look so much like that anymore. There are cover sheets on the data that explain the level of classification attached to it. There are special folders with markings on them. There will typically be a log on them that if someone has possession of that information, they need to fill out the log so that it's known, who has seen this information. Obviously, if someone gets a hold of it who's not supposed to, they're not going to fill out the log. But people who do, they're going to have no problem, filling out or keeping that log current. So, in the same way, if there is, if there are files, for example, that are confidential, so then they should be so labeled. If there's files that fall under HIPAA, they should be so labeled. Even on I would argue even on a a computer based storage system, right? So or you could even you could color mark such files. So maybe those files are marked in red, and that means kind of beware about disclosing that, and that's understood to be how they're identified. Okay, next, declassification. So in theory, classified data is periodically reviewed for declassification. In other words, being made public. In practice, I don't ever recall a situation where, in my military career, where that happened. And by the way, this is one of, I think, the problems with how the military and the larger government handles classified information. Is there's a tremendous amount of information that's classified that probably doesn't need to be. And then it's kept classified, even though it could be declassified. And there's so much of it that it becomes difficult to keep track of it all. And so I think, we need to be aware of the same lesson, if you will, in our businesses. What really needs to be kept a secret in our businesses, right? The less that we need to keep secret, the more effective we can be in keeping that secret, right? So I think that the tendency in the government over the last several decades is to keep more and more and more and more data classified, and it just makes it unwieldy. So again, I think we don't want to repeat that mistake in our businesses. And then, kind of along the same lines as declassification, there's the Freedom of Information Act, sometimes just called FOIA, based on its acronym. So the Freedom of Information Act grants any person, including non-citizens and businesses, the right to access records held by the federal government. So this is an outgrowth of things that happened in the 60s and in the 1960s and 1970s. Excuse me. Because files were being kept about people that shouldn't have been kept. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, was famous for doing that. And so a law was created whereby people could request access to federal government held data. So FOIA presumes that when someone requests the information will be released to that person. And in this sense, I use person broadly to also mean businesses, et cetera. Okay. And the way it works is the person submits a FOIA request. Some agencies have an online portal for doing so. Others, you have to send a request by mail. And then there's a time within which the agency has to respond to the FOIA request. Typically, it's around 20 business days. Okay. And the answer should be, here's the data, unless it falls under certain specific exemptions. And those exemptions are national security. And if it truly is a matter of national security, so then the data should not be released under a FOIA request. Now, you can say, well, wait a minute, who decides whether it's a matter of national security? And it's probably going to be agency staff who are going to do so. And there's a presumption that they're doing so in good faith, but of course, we've seen that's not always the case. Okay, law enforcement is another exemption from the requirement to disclose data under FOIA. Typically, an ongoing investigation or data that might damage the ability to enforce the law on some future situation. Even though there may not be something right at this moment that's going on with respect to that data. And same thing, it's incumbent upon the agency staff, generally speaking, to make these decisions. Okay, and then the last one is personal privacy. So we've seen where IRS data was improperly disclosed. So IRS data is not actually classified data per se. However, our tax returns are supposed to be kept private. And by the way, a FOIA request doesn't necessarily apply to classified data. It applies to any data that the federal government has, although it could be one could make a FOIA request for data that has a classification. Recognize that it's probably less likely that the FOIA request will be honored if data is classified. So in the case of personal property, again, the FOIA request would be turned down. So if you made a FOIA request for, my tax returns, presumably the IRS is going to say, no, those are private and you can't have that under a FOIA request. Now, you might be able to subpoena my tax returns if you had a reason to do so, and the court would oversee that the issuance of that subpoena, and so then the IRS presumably would comply. But with a FOIA request, probably not. Okay. So that's another way in which, in theory at least, classified data could be disclosed. Now, let's say you submit a FOIA request, excuse me, and the agency declines the FOIA request. They claim, national security, whatever. That's not the end of the matter. You do have the ability to appeal that decision on the part of the agency. You can go to court and to enforce compliance with your FOIA request. And so the judicial system is available to do so. And depending on what the issue is, that may be the case. Now, how would that apply in the civilian business world? Well, let's say you have let's say you have data protected by HIPAA. Okay, if you request that, you make a request for that data, which you certainly can do. Okay, most likely the healthcare provider is going to turn down that request, unless maybe it's data about yourself. But if it's data about someone else, they're almost for sure going to turn down that data. So is that the end of it? No, not necessarily, right? If you have a compelling reason for getting that data, so you could go to court and try to get the court to issue a subpoena, okay? And if the court felt you had a compelling reason, then they might issue a subpoena, and then the healthcare company under the subpoena would be obligated, most likely, to honor the subpoena. Now, if you have business secrets, okay, then presumably if someone were to make a request to see them, the answer is going to be no, right? That's a secret. However, let's say you were in some kind of patent fight where someone is suing you because they believe that you have stolen their intellectual property, right? So in that case, again, they may apply to a court to get a subpoena to get access to that secret information or that proprietary information, however you might describe it. And if the court believes there's a compelling reason for that individual or that other company to have access to that information, the court may grant it. They may put certain restrictions on the access to it, given that it is secret to your business. But there's, the fact that it's secret and you declare it so, you won't have the same, you won't have any greater protection than the government does. Okay, so that's how all of this can work, in a civilian world situation. Okay, access control. So people in the military, depending on who they are, may have a security clearance. Okay, so for example, all the years that I was in the Navy, I had a secret clearance, which in theory allowed me access to data classified at the secret level and below. Okay, the confidential and the for official use only level as well. I did not have access to top secret data. Now, when I was chaplain for a SEAL team, because I was with a SEAL team, so pretty much everybody at a SEAL team, gets access to top secret. Gets a top secret clearance, I should say. Doesn't get access necessarily, but gets a top secret clearance. And indeed, my unit had applied for me to get a top secret clearance. At the time, it was taking several years in order for a top secret clearance to be granted. And the fact of the matter was, I left the Navy before my top secret clearance could be granted. So whether it would have been or not, I don't know. I know I had to fill out, all kinds of paperwork. I had to go in for a meeting with a woman who, asked a whole lot of questions, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very serious process. Okay. Now, had I been granted a top secret clearance, that would not have meant that I could then go and just start looking at top secret information, because having the clearance alone does not justify seeing information. There also has to be a need to know, meaning as part of fulfilling my duties, I need to know this information. So, for example, let's say some of the operators in my SEAL team had a particular mission in a particular part of the world, and that information was top secret. It's extremely unlikely that even if I had a top secret clearance, I would have been given access to that data. Because why do I need to know that? As a chaplain, I would not be going on the mission, right? No way. Okay. And there's no reason for me to have that information. So even if let's say when the operators got back, one of them was struggling, and they came to me for counseling. So if the operator felt it was relevant for me to know where he was, because that was part of what was causing him the emotional difficulty, and so he needed for me to be able to talk about him with that, then maybe in that case he could disclose the top secret information to me. But my experience was, the operators I spoke with, they would just say, I was in a bad place or something like that. They would use a euphemism, because they recognized there was no real need for me to know the specifics of where they were. If they told me it was a bad place and they, and why it was a bad place, the danger or whatever, that was really what I needed to know to help them with, what had happened to them. And so this idea of a need to know is crucial. And I think that this is something we absolutely need to apply in our businesses. So when we have confidential or even secret information in our businesses, who gets access to any kind of information like that? That would be what we might call a security clearance. But just because they have their sort of security clearance in your business, do they really need to know this information? And if not, why would they? Why should they have access to it without some kind of control on them? Okay, so we should probably have systems in place so that confidential information and secret information is potentially available to certain employees or certain categories of employees, but not actually available to them unless there's a demonstrated need to know. And then depending on how sensitive the information is, that might determine who in your organization will determine whether a particular individual has a need to know. So in that way, we can be, do our best to make sure that we're keeping control of access. Okay, next. So security measures. So they're basically they fall into three categories. One is secure facilities, i.e., where people work with classified information, secure communication, how the information can go from sort of one person to another, and then data security itself. So secure facilities. So I think a good example of that is on a ship when I was deployed on the USS Ronald Reagan. So there was a room on the ship in the spaces occupied by the intelligence officers and enlisted people, where if there was top secret information to be conveyed from maybe an intelligence briefer to, let's say, a pilot, okay, they would go in that room, the door would be closed, and there was like a lock on it, almost like a bank vault, and only those two people, or if maybe there would be three people, whatever it was, could be in that room when that information was being disclosed. So it was an absolutely secure facility. That's how seriously the Navy takes, for example, information on where a particular squadron, for example, is going to conduct a mission. Right? It could potentially be disastrous for the enemy to know that a group of fighter attack jets is launching from our carrier to go provide, say, close air support on a military operation or a bombing mission or something, because then they could intercept them and potentially shoot them down, right? So that kind of information has to be kept very, very secret. And so the places where that information is dealt with are secure facilities. Okay, and even just to get into the intelligence spaces, like I never went into the intelligence spaces that I recall, because there was just no reason for me to be in there. If intelligence personnel wanted to see me, so they could come to my office and we could talk there, but there was no reason for me to be in their spaces. I didn't have a need to know any of that information. At least, maybe there are some chaplains that did, but I certainly did not. And so, I was not led into those facilities. Okay, so secure communication. While sometimes, as I described on the ship, communication was person to person, that's not, data cannot always be, transferred person to person. So sometimes, for example, data is transferred by email. So the military has two email systems. One is called NIPRNet, and the other is called SIPRNet. And I'm going to give you the names of them. We never called them. We just called them NIPR and SIPR. We never even use the net, and we certainly didn't use it. So NIPRNet stands for Non-Secure Internet Protocol Router Network, right? Only the government could come up with this. And as you might imagine, SIPR is Secret Internet Protocol Router Network. So most of us on a routine basis communicated on NIPR, okay? If we were dealing with classified information, then we would have a SIPR account, what was known as the high side. And oftentimes what you would do is if you were communicating with someone and then you had to communicate with them on you had to communicate classified information to them. So you would send them a NIPRNet email or a NIPR email saying, hey, check the high side. And then they knew to go check their SIPR account, which had a much more thorough protocol for logging into to get that communication of classified information. So when I was with the SEAL team, I did in fact have a SIPR account. I don't ever recall using it, candidly, but again, it was just it was standard protocol because I did have a secret security clearance. So if there had been a need for me to know about certain secret classified information, I had to have a way of receiving that information and or sending it. Okay. But like I said, I don't ever recall actually getting a SIPR email. And likewise in your businesses. So it probably doesn't make sense to have a SIPR type level of security in your day-to-day email communications, because most of that stuff is not particularly it's not really confidential and not secret. So to have, your regular email system would be, pretty much like a NIPR email system. But when it comes to these, business secrets and or confidential information, it may, make sense for you to have the equivalent of a SIPR type network that only certain people have access to, and those people are routinely audited, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then finally, data security. So classified data is stored using media that has controlled access. Oftentimes it's encrypted. Excuse me, that sort of, I'm sorry, not encrypted. It's encoded to make it difficult to get it off. The data storage, that data storage may not be networked in the way regular data storage may be. And again, we can replicate all of these in our businesses in order to keep secret data in our businesses from being wrongly disclosed. Okay, and finally, the last thing, discipline. So during my time in the Navy, as a chaplain, there were a few times when sailors, I don't recall Marines ever having done this, but a few times when sailors were caught disclosing classified data. And depending on how egregious it was, they would be subject to disciplinary measures. And oftentimes I would be called in to help make a determination as to what should happen to this sailor, especially if there were some kind of potentially mitigating circumstances. So in my experience, and this happened primarily when I was with aviation and submarines, so the commanding officers didn't want to be unjust. On the other hand, they needed to make sure that information was kept, classified data was kept appropriately classified. So oftentimes, I don't recall ever where I knew what the data breach had been. I just knew that one had taken place, and I was given a sense of what the potential consequences were for that data breach. Now, what I will tell you is I never had a situation where a sailor was not disciplined for a data breach. Okay, and maybe at some of the very, very high levels, there was, discipline was overlooked. But honestly, with especially junior enlisted people, kind of, E1s through kind of E3s, E4s, E5s, even E6s, never saw it. They were always disciplined. Okay, minimally, they would suffer a loss of their security clearance. And it kind of makes sense. If someone has improperly handled classified information, so they're in a way saying, I am not qualified to have access to it. Okay. Now, by the way, losing a security clearance oftentimes meant that they lost the current job that they had, because the billet they were in, a lot of billets in aviation and submarines require that the personnel have a security clearance. And indeed, I think everyone on a submarine has at least a secret clearance, right? And to be in that environment, you're going to almost inevitably be exposed to some classified data. If only when you're on a mission and you know where you are. So, it's expected that you'll keep that confidential. So, and by the way, I never dealt with anyone who, I think was a spy. Typically, the disclosures were inadvertent. So, for example, they might disclose to a spouse, "Hey, meet me in this place at this time, because we're going to be pulling into port." And we're talking about a submariner, and that was classified information, shouldn't have been disclosed, and so bang, there you are, improper disclosure. So if that sailor lost his security clearance, he would probably also be transferred out of submarines, because he couldn't be on the boat any longer. So that's kind of the lowest level. The next level is what's called NJP, non-judicial punishment. And this is essentially a type of punishment where the accused appears before his commanding officer, and there is a discussion of what was done wrong. There's a discussion of whether what was alleged to have gone wrong actually happened, and if so, what the results were. And then the commanding, assuming that the person is held responsible, so then the commanding officer is authorized to discipline the person. So in the Navy and Marine Corps, we call that going to mast, or captain's mast, and it comes from when wooden sailing ships existed, and when these kind of disciplinary hearings were held, they were held at the mast, one of the masts of the ship, the wooden masts that held the sails. Now they're just held in the CO's office, generally speaking. And the type of punishment could be anything from loss of pay. It could be depending on the where it happens. So if you went to NJP on a ship, you could be put in the brig for a certain period of time. You could be put in the brig and with an only allowed bread and water. I know that sounds really archaic, but we had a situation, a sailor in a squadron went to NJP. In this case, it wasn't for a breach of classified information. He had been caught with some illegal drugs, and he was put in the brig for, I believe it was 30 days on bread and water. So we could have all the bread and water to eat and drink he wanted, but that's all he got. No ice cream, no vegetables, no nothing, right? And it was difficult, and he was bored out of his mind, because I was the only person besides his chief petty officer and his CO who were allowed to interact with him, and his CO never did. It's just not what COs do, generally speaking. Okay. And by the way, another possibility for NJP is what's called administrative separation. So basically getting kicked out of the Navy. If the breach was serious enough, and especially if the service member shows, no remorse, they very well could be kicked out on an administrative basis. And by the way, sometimes a loss of clearance will essentially affect the same thing. So by losing their clearance, they no longer are able to operate in the Navy, and Marine Corps, same thing. And so they are kicked out. Now, next up from there is a court martial. If you've ever seen the movie, the one with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise, A Few Good Men. Okay, now that's pretty heavily dramatized, but I have been at court martial proceedings as a witness, and while the movie makes it much more dramatic, it largely works that way. And it's like a trial. It's a trial held under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ. And in this case, there's typically a jury. It's typically made up of officers, and they hear the accusations and the testimony supporting that. They hear the defense and the testimonies supporting that, and then they reach a decision just like any jury would. And if the breach of classified data is serious enough, the sailor could get court-martialed. Okay, if, for example, if the sailor took some classified data, some secret data or top secret data, and stored it in his room, maybe he was intending to study it. So he wasn't intending to give it to any foreign agent or anything like that, but he took it out of a classified facility, or maybe he emailed it to himself, to his private email address, because he needed to study the information in preparation for a mission or something. Okay, something like that could very well be a court-martial offense. It's so egregious, and once classified data is outside of the restricted control environment, really anyone can get a hold of it. By the way, when my family and I visited Hong Kong, this was in 2010, I believe it was, I had to go through an intelligence briefing. And one of the things I was told was I was not allowed to bring a cell phone, a computer, or anything like that into Hong Kong. And if I did, I would most likely be court-martialed. And the reason is because even if I didn't use those devices in Hong Kong, and even if I didn't, go online in Hong Kong, once they were there, even if I didn't disclose that I was in the Navy, it would pretty easily be found out. And so it would be very likely that my room would be searched. And if they found those devices, they would very quickly download everything on them. Even if it, meant nothing in the end, it was standard policy for the Chinese government to do that. Even back then, when this is before Hong Kong was essentially taken over by mainland China, and I thought that was pretty ridiculous at the time. I was taking an online college course, and I said to the man giving me the briefing, I said, "Look, I'm taking this online college course. I have to keep up with my studies. I need my computer." And he said, "Well, you got two choices. Take care of your college studies at a time other than when you're in Hong Kong, and don't bring your computer with you, or risk getting kicked out of the Navy." And he said, "Just so you know, an admiral brought a laptop into Hong Kong, and he was severely disciplined for doing so." An admiral, right? So, okay, well, that sort of settled that. We did not bring cell phones. We did not bring laptops. We didn't bring any electronic devices into Hong Kong. That was it. Okay. But had I, it's entirely possible I would have been, held to a court-martial. Okay. And then finally, if it's egregious enough, there could be criminal proceedings, which is, I think there's a case pending right now. I want to say a National Guardsman or something disclosed some classified data, and I think he's being prosecuted criminally, in addition to going through a court-martial. Now, from private business standpoint, right? All of these can apply, right? So to the extent that we have a system for determining who even gets to have access to confidential or secret data that our company has, there should be some kind of system about who has access, and if they misuse the authority to access it, then they lose that authority. That may mean they get demoted. It may mean that they can no longer work at your company, and that would all be, I think, absolutely reasonable. You might have a form of non-judicial punishment where the person's supervisor meets with the person, and there's some kind of disciplinary measures taken. Now, probably can't do loss of salary. That probably violates labor laws, etc. But there could be, the person could be maybe subject to being fired or being put on a leave of absence without pay for a certain period of time in order to demonstrate the seriousness of what they did. Okay. Finally, court martial, probably not a court martial in the sense of a jury trial within the confines of your company. That I'm not sure that necessarily makes sense, but you may file a criminal proceeding against an employee who egregiously disclosed secrets, especially if they were engaged in some kind of industrial espionage. So all of these are, with maybe the exception of court-martial, could be ways that you enforce the keeping of information confidential and secret on the part of your company. So I know we went over time, and I think this was an important subject to cover. Just real quickly then, these are places where you can ask questions, get some help. They'll be in the show notes. Here's the legal information, and go ahead and close this out now. So thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you found this interesting. And tomorrow at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. We're going to be talking about how to maintain a business entity. Okay, so just because you start an entity doesn't mean you're done. There are things you may need to do quarterly, annually, every 2 years, depending on what kind of entity it is and where it was organized, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to talk about the most typical tasks and filings that you have to make in order to maintain your business entity. So I hope you'll join me tomorrow, Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And then we'll be back next week, Monday at 10 a.m. for the next episode of Trust and Estates Weekly, and 7 days from today for the next episode of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you very much for watching today, and just signing off as I always do. Marie, you are my bell. All the best, folks. Have a great rest of the day.